Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Source Booksellers Friday Night Date Night with Authors. We are so pleased that you joined us this evening. Source Booksellers is a small independent bookstore in Midtown Detroit, and we love having authors, and we love having authors who have written about books that we have had in the store. This is a new one, and we're so pleased to have the two authors with us. I want to thank Allison, the other part of Salsa Source Booksellers, for all the work that she's done to bring these two people to our screen tonight. And know that we're always looking to improve ourselves and to bring to you those that which we think is so important in the literary world. So, Allison.
So, we have a section in the store called By and About Women. And so, this particular book is 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 perfect for the category, and it's also purple, and I love purple. And so Dr. Tillett is a scholar and a cultural critic and an activist, previously a professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Tillett was also a visiting fellow at Princeton and a scholar in residence at the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center, and we love to go to their events. She is currently the Henry Rutgers Professor of African American Studies and Creative Writing at Rutgers University in Newark. The faculty director of New Arts Justice at Express Newark and a contributing critic at large at the New York Times. With her sister, she founded A Long Walk Home. And you may be familiar with this. It's an art organization that empowers young people to end violence against girls and women. In conversation with her today is a brilliant professor from Wayne State University. Dr. Winters is an associate professor of African American Studies and English at Wayne State University here in Detroit, Michigan. Currently, she's consumed with the day-to-day practice of mothering a Black girl in this time of now. And her current research interests center on Black motherhood, Black radical love, and the possibilities therein for imagining and enacting freedom for Black children. She's the author of The Mulatto
Concubine.
Concubine, Terror, Intimacy, Freedom, and the Desire in the Black Transatlantic. And that book is also, both books are available on sourcebooksellers.com.
Online.
Online.
Source Book, that's
Source
right.
Booksellers online. So we have two sites to choose from. So we're going to bring on our authors. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Allison and Janet, for inviting me to Detroit online. But I was at the University of Michigan for a year. I had a postdoc there right after I finished grad school. And so I had a lot of time and a lot of opportunities to visit Detroit. So I look forward to meeting you in person. And thank you for this opportunity to be here this evening. And Lisa, I look forward to talking to you. And I love this idea. I'm a two of a parent of a Black girl and a Black boy who you can probably hear in the background. So I love this idea of your job in many ways is imagining how to raise them in this moment. It's a beautiful and radical endeavor. So thank you.
Allison said a word about our category in the store called By and About Women. We are a nonfiction bookstore primarily, and one of our 5 categories is By and About Women, history and culture, health and well-being, and spirituality and metaphysics, and the arts. So your book fits all of this. And I am so delighted that we have a hometown girl from Wayne State University, Detroit, who is with us this evening. So we want you to take it away.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I guess, it makes sense. A book by a Black woman like Alice Walker. I guess we could talk about this, Lisa. Woodcover is so expansive in both its vision and the themes that it covers. So I'll begin with an excerpt from the beginning of the book on page 4 for those of you who have it. So the first time I read The Color Purple, I was 15 years old and spending the summer in Boston with my dad, preparing to apply for early decision to the University of Pennsylvania. I had just been let go from my part-time canvassing gig at an environmental law center because my boss realized that I was too young to be knocking on people's doors well past dusk. Since it was too late for me to pick up another summer job, I ended up answering phones, sorting mail, and volunteering at the local NAACP office. During my breaks, I'd pick up the latest of my weekly books that my cousin's tall, light brown skinned girlfriend, Nicole, gave me to read. She was only 2 years older than I was, but already an English major at Penn herself, and sensing that I was on the verge of an identity crisis, she felt obligated to help me build up my armor of African American literature. In turn, 3 books in particular determined my fate. Alex Haley's The Autobiography of Malcolm X, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and Alice Walker's The Color Purple. By the time I returned home to New Jersey and to my suburban private high school that fall, I felt armed with a new vocabulary of racial pride and Black feminism. Walker's protagonist, Celie Harris, a dark brown-skinned girl, African-American girl, born in segregation, made the book all the more fascinating to me. Dear God, Celie opens the novel. I am 14 years old. I've always been a good girl. Maybe you can give me a sign, letting me know what is happening to me. What Celie was unable to name was the fact that the man she called Pa repeatedly raped her as her enfeebled mother wasted away in the next room. You better not tell nobody but God, he warns. It'll kill your mammy. By creating a protagonist who was a victim of racism and repeated rapes, and also a figure who eventually was able to break her silence and tell her story on her own terms, Walker turned Celie into one of the most original characters in all of literature. I've gone back to The Color Purple many times since that summer of 1991. After I was raped by an African-American fraternity boy whom I was dating during my first year of college, and again after I was sexually assaulted by a near stranger on my college study abroad program in Kenya. Years later, after struggling with an eating disorder, contemplating suicide, and going to intensive therapy, I poured out all my anger and heartache in my own poem, Do You Know What Rape Feels Like? As I retold my trauma, I leaned directly on Walker's words. Midway through my poem, I began in great detail to break down the intimate horror of my rape. Do you know what it feels like to have our howl silenced by a fist? When you are rushed into, pressed down on, and opened by a knife? A blade so thick, so strong, so brilliant that your insides no longer exist? That your scraped against insides bleed out into a yell that only you and others like you can hear? Screaming until it stops, no, until you think it stops. And then from nowhere, from no one, it keeps on. He continues to destroy your petals with his, you don't even want to say it. I broke my silence because of The Color Purple. At every stage of my healing, I found something new in the novel, unseen themes or turns of phrases that I ignored in my previous visits. When my sister asked if she could document my healing with her camera, I handed my poem over to her. A few months later, when she adapted her photographs and my story into the stage performance Story of a Rape Survivor, our actress, Rachel Walker, gave life to my words and let Celie's words be her creative guide. If Celie gave voice to my rape in my teens and my early 20s, it was Shug, in her bodiness and bodily confidence, whom I needed in my 30s as I entered a belated phase of sexual exploration. Among the pantheon of Black women characters whom I introduced my students when I first started teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, Shug meant the most to me. Her sexual fluidity and unabashed desires gave me permission to experiment unapologetically with men and women and long for more. Now, I live differently with The Color Purple. A lot more healed, yet still tender. I revel in Sophia's anger. Her rage at being doubly oppressed as Black and as woman fuels me as I raise and protect my Black children, a 5-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl in our age of unbridled racism. In the book, but especially on screen and on stage, Sophia captures my attention and dares me to be more like her. This is why every time I pick up the novel, even the one I teach from, covered by pastel stickies with its dog-eared pages, I feel as if it is for the very first time, finding and falling in love with a new moment that somehow I missed before. I tried not to carry the enormousness of not the novel's meaning for me when I finally met Alice Walker. I wasn't sure if I should remain professionally detached or not disclose my experiences with sexual assault, or if I should tell her that I'd read every poem, essay, short story, and novel that she'd published since 1970, and that she, more than any artist I've discovered before or after her, gave me permission as a Black woman to be a full-fledged feminist. I was so afraid that my euphoria would spill out or that I'd fumble, that when my sister and I approached her haiku-inspired house standing at the top of the hill with only a bunch of periwinkles standing between us and her, I did not hug Alice Walker or thank her for writing the book that made my healing possible. Instead, I put on my writer's cap, introduced my sister as a photographer, and began to take notes. Gone were Alice's long locks. Now a short silver mane crowned her head, and she walked with an unbelievable lightness. And when she took us out on the back porch of Temple Juke, the name she used for her house in our email correspondence, we 3 Black women stood silently together. Alice on the verge of her 75th birthday, Scheherazade, a newly minted 40-year-old, and I, a bunted to my 44th year, looked out only to see a crescendo of mountains standing between us and the horizon. After a minute, a deep inhale, and with a wry smile on her face, Walker asked, "Why do we need heaven when we have this?" And when I turned my head to catch her question, I realized that Alice Walker was the freest Black woman I'd ever met. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. It's something to hear you read it aloud, you know. It's such a privilege to be here and to be here with Source Booksellers, and also just to talk to you about this wonderful work. And I'm so excited to hear so much. And I know, I sent some questions ahead of time, but as you know, once you get into the room and what somebody brings into the space can change the shape in really wonderful ways. So I'm so grateful that you read this opening passage. And initially when I read this opening from your book, what struck me was, when you said, I realized Alice Walker was the freest Black woman I'd ever met. And I was like, what does that mean for you, right? And what does that, when we think about freedom and we think about like kind of the freedom of community, like collective freedom, and what does individual freedom, or what does it mean to be a free Black woman, right, in this space? And so I was wondering if you could maybe start with that, and then I do want to backtrack a little bit, but I would love to hear that counter.
That's a great question. I think, well, part of what I set up in the beginning of the book is just, all that anxiety that I have when you're meeting an icon, or you're meeting as a reader, someone whose work has impacted you so much, and yet you have to kind of restrain yourself. So there was part of that. There was like, what should I wear, and how should I appear? And Alice is a bit of a recluse in many ways, right? And so, and she's allowing me into her home, and so there's all this kind of like, there's like high stakes, both as just a person who is a fan of The Color Purple, and then as someone who's writing a book about The Color Purple. So there was that, and I was aware of my own insecurities that I was experiencing, but then also, you know, it was pretty amazing to see her living on like literally on 40 acres of land that she bought as a result of her writing career. She bought the first 20 acres, I think, after The Color Purple, and then she subsequently bought the next 20 acres. And just so standing on the top of a mountain with a Black woman who has such a strong connection to the land, right? She's a sharecropper's daughter. And so she understood quite early on that connection between property and personhood, right? That connection between a kind of self of ownership and freedom. This is, for Black people, this is such a crucial part of our identity in the new world, because we were rendered as property. But I think someone who grew up in the segregated South, and as a daughter and a granddaughter of sharecroppers, there's a way in which it has a particular meaning to her. And so Alice is an owner of many properties, but she also has this really strong connection to the land and to earth as a place that needs to be preserved and taken care of. And so all of that, I think, there's that, and then there's her spiritual ethos, and there's a lightness to Alice Walker, despite the gravity and the levity of her words. And so all of that, I guess, was, wow, it's a lot at once to encounter. And I think she has all of that when you're in her spirit and you're in her presence, in a way that you kind of want to have some of that for yourself. You want to be able to, and she's earned that. And I think my book in many ways is a testament to the trials and the test, and the ways in which, at least with the experience of The Color Purple, which is obviously her most famous novel, that Alice has earned the right to have that sense of freedom. And I don't know, I want to kind of capture all that pretty early on in the book, so you then can understand my journey through The Color Purple, but also what The Color Purple has inspired in her, I think, in addition to all the other people that I write about.
Yeah, no, I mean, and as you were reading, and then as you were talking just now, and the sense that she's earned this, you know, one of the things that struck me while you were reading and reading your own poem that you wrote, that her book allowed you to write, right? I was just thinking about the telling and retelling of these stories. And also because part of what your book is about is the telling and retelling of The Color Purple in these various kind of iterations, right? From book to film to musical, but also with each kind of iteration or revision, I guess, right? Or reimagination of the book, Alice Walker also has to kind of go through and re-go through, right, a certain kind of, I mean, the criticism that she just has to endure with each one, the stakes of kind of like owning the story and how it gets told, what gets lost and what gets brought back. And so this is just a very wide open question, because for me, it's both about the story you're telling about Alice Walker and the re-articulations of The Color Purple, but also like what it means for you to tell and retell your story through her story, and kind of just, again, kind of thinking about, you know, as a process for healing, right? So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that a little bit, from however you want to kind of enter. Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I break the book up as, you know, in 3 parts. Celie, Shug, and Sophia are the different headers for the different sections. And they are aligned with Celie's primarily about the novel. Shug is primarily about the film, and Sophia is primarily about the musical. And then again, as I talked about in my opening reading, that those are also different stages of my maturity into adulthood as a Black woman. So I think one of the things that is pretty striking, because, you know, The Color Purple, the way that we understand it now and the way that it's, the movie and the book are almost synonymous, I think, in a lots of people's imaginations. And also they're so beloved. is pretty striking given the fact that when the novel comes out, Alice, of course, is the first Black woman to win the Pulitzer Prize in fiction, Gwendolyn Brooks being the first to win a Pulitzer Prize at all. But she's the first to win it in fiction, and she also wins the National Book Award. So there's a celebration of the novel on Hello, right? But then there's also this growing backlash that we can see not just with Alice Walker, but with Ntozake Shange for Colored Girls, and that's starting in the late 70s, and that kind of really comes to head with the Color Purple, where there's a kind of resentment for a newfound interest in Black women's writing and Black women's literature. So as literary scholars, we call it, the Renaissance, I think they used to call it Black women's writing, the advent of Black feminist literature. I mean, there's different categories. But there also was a strong, and with that came new types of stories and insights about Black life. And while writers like Toni Morrison or Gloria Naylor or Alice Walker or Ntozake Shange weren't the first to show violence within Black families and violence, domestic violence and sexual violence amongst Black people, they're not the first in African American literature, right? Richard Wright does this in Native Son, and Ralph Ellison does it in Invisible Man. There is a way in which, and particularly with The Color Purple, the way in which they took seriously the voices of the Black girls and women who experienced such harm, rendered it so that they were seen as breaking taboos or airing dirty laundry. So another way of saying that is by prioritizing the voices of the girls and women who were experiencing the violence, they centered their lives. And that was seen as something that one should not do, because what was at risk was racial unity. And what was at risk was Black people living in a time of Reagan and a systematic and state violence against Black people. And there wasn't time to talk about these other issues that were happening in the home. So Alice, on one hand, is breaking the taboo around stories that we're supposed to share. She's being highly celebrated in the literary world. And then comes this movie that does get nominated for 11 Oscars, but never doesn't win any, but is taken on directed by Steven Spielberg, produced by Quincy Jones. And it's a real feat in some ways in terms of an African-American story with a predominantly African-American cast that does get such financial backing from a Hollywood studio. And so there was a lot of debate about what kinds of stories Black people should be shown, what kind of Black stories should be told, and what kind of representations of Black men the movie The Color Purple was perpetuating. And so there's a whole debate. And this is, I guess, part of what the Alice's journeys, each iteration is a new test for her. This was the book was it came to her, and she had to move from New York to San Francisco to Northern California, and the characters tugged on her. They kept on saying, I can't survive in these urban atmospheres. I need to be out in the country. And we're country folks like Alice's family. And so that's one test, to be able to create this novel, for it to come into the world, and then to decide to make it into a film, and then to have the backlash that was really, really, really vicious. Beverly Guy Sheftall describes Alice as the most hated Black woman in America, and probably the most hated Black woman alongside or until Anita Hill testifies before the Senate Judiciary Committee with allegations of sexual harassment against Clarence Thomas. So there's a way in which each iteration, like you said, brings with it its own potential for artistic newness, its ability to reach a new audience, and also brought lots of controversy. The musical, not so much, because by the time the musical comes along, the story is almost so much part of our cultural DNA that we forget that people wanted to boycott it and ban it at all.
Yeah.
That was a long answer.
No, this is, and I think that, even as you're talking, and then while I was reading this, and, I when I was in college, I was in college in the late 80s, early 90s. And so, so your book in a way took me back to these moments, right? Both of like kind of my own discovery, discovery is such a loaded term, but my own kind of, coming into reading Alice Walker and Ntozake Shange and Toni Morrison, and also being in that moment. And you do talk about this in your book as well. I think like, into like the early 90s, being in this moment of being like this, and I always try and get my students to kind of like understand this moment of 1990s hip hop, right? And like consciousness, but it was so hyper masculine in certain ways, right? So we had like, the Malcolm X medallions and all of that. And so I think that, so this book kind of brings back this, this memory of like, and there was this profound homophobia in there too, right? And one of the things that struck me when I was reading your work is I do remember understanding that the criticism and the backlash that Alice Walker especially received was around the portrayal of Black masculinity and a violent Black masculinity. But I forgot that a large part of the controversy and the backlash was also around the representation of the relationship between her and Suge and lesbian or queer sexuality. And so I was wondering if you can kind of talk about that in terms of, again, this process of retelling and then healing in both your book and in the novel in its iterations.
Yeah, I mean, we're probably close in age, and so I think people think of like the 70s and Black nationalism as like where those debates were happening around homophobia and feminism and Black nationalism. But we are the child of the Black Power movement, and we are the children of the Black feminist movement. And so in the 1990s, you were still having these real debates. And as Black women, we were really trying to figure out, like, I'm a hip hop, we're the hip hop generation. So we have an allegiance to a particular kind of racial analysis. At the same time, we're trying to, find our way into this culture that is ours, and oftentimes, at least in the early 1990s, hyper masculinist, as you said. And so that's where the literature for me came in. That's where these books of these women who were able to write not my story, maybe they were writing their story, maybe they're writing their mother's story. Alice was writing her grandmother's story. But it opened up a world to me that was living alongside the hip hop music and customs and rituals that I was part of. But also gave me the language of Black feminism. And I wanted to also recapture that moment, because I think when, now if you meet people of our generation, we were always Black feminists, and it was always preordained, or and it was so easy. And really, in fact, it really was quite difficult, but then not as difficult as what Alice went through, right? Like they paid the cost for us to have that struggle. And so I wanted to capture the debates I was in on a college campus, a predominantly white college campus, around Black nationalism, around Black feminism, talk about my own homophobia and the ways in which that precluded certain kinds of my struggle, because I went into college quite, I'd gone to my first gay pride parade my senior year of high school, and then I go to Penn and I'm having debates about something I know I shouldn't be having debates about, right? But that the nation and Black nationalism and 5%ers, that was all the kind of Philly milieu. So I wanted to capture all of that. I want to capture that energy, and to show how long the divide over the color purple lasted. Like, it just wasn't in the 80s, in 82 when the book comes out, or 85 when the movie comes out. It actually is quite long lasting to, in my case, the early 90s, when I'm on college campuses and we're debating whether the movie is racist still. And I'm not sure how I landed. I can't remember. And so I wanted to show my own journey to feminism and how it was fraught and not always easy, and not, like I said, over determined, even though it probably would seem so now.
Oh, I so appreciate the vulnerability and the transparency in your writing and in this book. And you mentioned, so I want to maybe kind of circle back because you mentioned that this is her grandmother's story, and
Yeah.
you you open the book with a family tree, and so this was like, I did not know how these characters mapped onto Alice Walker's family tree. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that and why you thought it was so important for us to see this.
Yeah, it was my editor, Jameson Stoltz. It was his suggestion because he's reading my book and he's like, "Wait, like maybe it would be helpful if you can map the character." Because I'm like, and this person is based on this person, and this person is based on this person. And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's brilliant. That's like such a great way to think about the family tree and a character map as one and the same." So yeah, I mean, Alice's the inspiration for many of Alice's characters come directly from her family, and not necessarily that the people in the story lived exactly the lives of the characters, but that they were inspiration. So as Celie is based on her grandmother, her step grandmother, but her grandmother, Rachel Little. Albert is based on her grandfather, Henry Clay Walker. Harpo is based on her father. Sophia is based on her mother. Nettie is based on literally the same name as her maternal grandmother. And who else am I? Oh, Shug, this was the biggest revelation, that like Shug Avery was actually based on her grandfather's partner, who he continued to have a lifelong relationship with, even as he was married to Rachel, right? So to think of Shug as like an actual person whose nickname was Shug was pretty remarkable. So part of what is interesting about the fact that these are based on her family also goes back to this notion of the criticism that was launched against her, that she was seen as anti-Black family, that she was seen as, someone compared her, the film, to Birth of a Nation, that the attacks against her for being anti-Black male really stung even more, because these are people that she knew. These were like flesh and blood Black people that she was not there to critique, actually, but she was trying to lovingly portray. And so I think it just gave me a different sensitivity towards the journey of The Color Purple. And then I end the book with a scene of being at her family grave site. And, you know, I'd gone to Eatonton the year before her 75th birthday with Beverly Guy Sheftall and Valerie Boyd. And I'd gone to the grave site, and then I wrote the book, or I was writing the book. And then I come back, and seeing Rachel's name meant something very different to me. So that's kind of like my own journey to these people, and how understanding the intimacy between Alice and the characters changed as a result of my own research and my own attempt to get closer to the story of The Color Purple than I had been before.
There's this passage, this isn't the passage I mentioned earlier, I found it, but you know, I think that when you find the photograph, and maybe you could talk about when you find the photograph of Miss Rachel and Minnie Lou and Grandma, and I think this is on page 33 is when, like 32, 33. I was wondering if you would maybe read that and kind of talk about that moment for you, and the conversation around Celie and her beauty or ugliness, and how we've just kind of taken that on its, taken Mr. at his word. Sorry to scream the passage.
Oh, no, it's fine. I'm trying to find a good opening.
Maybe the 3 months.
And the 3 months. Where is that? What page is that?
That's at page 32.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess the setup for this is that when we're at Alice's house, like a couple of months before, she's trying to find a picture of, she has a poem in her her latest book. So this is another way in which The Color Purple kind of lives on in Alice Walker's life, that in her book, Take the Arrow Out of the Heart, she had a poem called Is Celie Actually Ugly? And so that book comes out, I think, in 2018. And so she's still, The Color Purple is still very much alive in her writing. And so I asked her a question about, well, why did you write that poem, you know, like so many years later, and da 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 da. And so she gives a context that she felt like a lot of the people who play the character Celie, or even the readers of the book, somehow believe that Celie is actually ugly, and she doesn't understand why anyone would trust Pa's rendition of Celie. And then I realized myself that, my goodness, did I do that? You know, so anyway, so we're there and she's trying to find this picture of her grandmother, and she just can't find it. Like the first day she's looking for it and she's like, can't find it. So that was that. And we leave her house, and I'm like, I wonder if in the archive there's a picture, like you know, and it's a great writer's thing, right? You're like on the quest to find the thing that she couldn't give me, but that perhaps I can give to myself and give to you. So that's the setup for this scene. And so Alice and I are both at the National Women's Studies Association conference in Atlanta. And so I'll just read the scene. So I guess quickly, before I go to the conference, and I'm presenting on a panel, I go to Emory's archive, and I have a very short window to do anything. And I barely make it to my panel on time, but I did. 3 months after I met Walker, I was in Atlanta to present at the National Women's Studies Association conference. I had a few free hours, so I decided to revisit her archives at Emory's Stewart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library. There, among the hundreds of images, was only one with the name Rachel. When I requested it, I half expected to see a grinning Whoopi Goldberg looking back at me. So memorable was her performance from the film version. Instead, I cradled in my hand a 3x5 and black and white picture of 4 women. Written on the back of the photo in pen were 4 names: Aunt Minnie Lou, Miss Mary, Miss Rachel, Grandma. I tried to match their names to their faces. The next day, I excitedly texted the picture to Walker. It was late, and I knew that she'd just spent hours in Atlanta in a packed auditorium in a public conversation with Beverly Guy Sheftall. So I assumed she'd either be too tired to respond or was on her way back to California. At first, her response to my fact-finding mission was to be as helpful and instructive as possible. She told me that the teenage girl looking at me with folded hands and a slight lean was Minnie Lou, who eventually became Walker's mother. Next to her was Miss Mary, a dark brown-skinned family friend of above average height. And then she simply texted grandmother, referring to the next 2 women. I was confused. Which grandmother? Who is Rachel? A family friend or her grandmother too? Bewildered, I texted her again to gain more clarity. But once I boarded my flight and had no Wi-Fi, I lost my connection to Alice Walker and her past. Staring at the picture as I sat on the plane, I searched her grandmother's faces for recognition. I assumed that the stout figure with the white brimmed hat was her maternal grandmother, Nettie Lou. But a woman in a black dress and white shoes stood out among the others, who were also wearing white dresses and black flats. Miss Rachel, with braids and a polka dot ruffled frock, had the softest expression on her oval face. Her almond complexion, akin to that of another woman of her era, the famous dancer and chanteuse, Josephine Baker. The image was far closer to the 1981 sketch of Celie in Alice's journal that she texted me after we first met. And this is a quote from Alice's journal. Being skinny is Celie's major fault. Since when one is a woman and very skinny with tiny breasts, one's form was not considered womanly. Hence Mr.'s frequent reminders to Celie that you shaped funny. Together we would say Celie has a model's figure. Her ugliness consists of furtive, beaten down manner and unkempt hair and clothing. She had no one to teach her how to care for herself. And she begins to create herself through her writing, her love of Shug and Nettie. She begins to take on an outer beauty that approximates the extraordinary loveliness of her spirit. As I looked at Rachel again and again, I was a bit ashamed, but mostly transfixed by my own error. I had not believed in her beauty either. I assumed that when Walker was embellishing her loveliness, she was trying to make up for Rachel's pain by attempting to convince me of her innate beauty. But I was the problem because I had chosen not to see Rachel. When I landed in Newark near midnight, my phone vibrated with a new message that Alice must have sent me while I was mid-air. She wrote me a short note that instantly reshaped the prism through which I saw Rachel, and as a result, how I would teach Celie's character going forward. This was before her hardest years with my grandmother. Walker texted about Rachel. As I stood in the quiet airport, Alice's words bouncing off my bright screen offset my wave of exhaustion. She was really the best looking of all, she wrote. They couldn't see that then. It was my first time reading it, so I was like, what's the words?
No, I really, I got chills because like you, I just thought like, oh my gosh, it never occurred to me to not to question Mr.'s assessment, right? And so, and I think that part of that is, I mean, part of it is just kind of like how we read, but after reading your book, I rewatched the movie and I haven't seen the film in a while. And the scene where Suge, comes in and is like, "You're ugly." Like it just made me see that moment differently, right? And see that moment in the book differently in terms of thinking about like, oh, wait, she, and even though Suge herself tells us later that she only said that because of jealousy, for some reason that like drops out, right? It's just like Celie is ugly. And then to kind of think about how, especially if we think about, Black girlhood, and the vulnerability of Black girlhood, the way that the ugliness becomes the rationale, right, for the abuse of Celie or for why she suffers, as opposed to the fact that it's patriarchy, it's misogyny, right? Her abuse has nothing to do with her, but the way that we whoever we is, right, but just kind of like, those of us that are like socialized in the US around like ideas around beauty. And so and maybe, and I want to open this up because I know that I want people to have the opportunity to ask questions, but maybe you can talk a little bit about, because the notion of beauty makes me think of the art and the practice of art, and art is healing, but also the title of your work, right, which calls to mind, one of Alice Walker's most famous essays. So I was wondering if maybe you could, and not just the first part of the title. I'm looking at your book behind you, the first part, but also the story of an American masterpiece. So maybe you could talk about that, and then if
the title, yeah, and beauty, yeah, that's great. Well, just the title quickly, so the In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, like, wait, what's the title? In Search of Our Mother's Gardens was the first creative nonfiction that Alice had done. And so it's the first book that also comes out after The Color Purple. And so I thought that was just like an inspiring, so to me, she has the definition of womanism there. She reprints the essay on looking for Zora, on Zora Neale Hurston. And she also has an essay there about the origins of The Color Purple. So as literary critics and culture critics, like, it's just like, it's like, oh yeah, like that book does so much. So why not play with that quest that she had, looking for, she has this beautiful, and I quoted it in my book, this just beautiful moment when she talks about our great grandmothers and the fact that they couldn't be artists. And so oftentimes they may have turned to other forms of creativity like gardening, but oftentimes they couldn't even do that. And so she says something, the answer is cruel enough to stop blood, I think, the way in which their creative impulses were stunted by slavery and also by segregation. And so to be a writer, to become Alice Walker, is a revolutionary act. And for us to then inherit that legacy is also quite deeply transformative and radical. So I wanted to pay homage to In Search of the Color Purple because it's a groundbreaking book, but also I think it's in terms of the writing, it's the one that gave me insight into how I could approach a story like this. And then the story of American Masterpiece, I mean, it's been so fascinating during this book tour, because in many ways, like, there's no case to be made about The Color Purple in terms of its impact on American culture, right? So she wins the National Book Award, she wins the Pulitzer, the movie is nominated for 11 Oscars, and the musical wins a Tony. Like, there's no book that in each of its iterations achieves such magnificent success according to the standards of the industry that they're in. And also, this book is kind of like a cultural touchstone for Black America, right? Like, the story of The Color Purple is the story of Black America. And that's why Kendrick Lamar uses the line from Sophia's famous, or Oprah's famous monologue that she does as playing the character Sophia in his song, All Right, which is the anthem of Black Lives Matter. All my life I had to fight, right? Like, if Sophia's story of abuse, racial and gender-based violence, is the story of how Black people have had to survive in a new world. And so this idea of it being a masterpiece is kind of, that's a preordained truth. And yet I still feel like there's a way in which works by Black women, despite the fact that they have rewritten everything, all the rules, transcended all of the standards, sometimes aren't treated still as if they are masterpieces, right? Like, I feel like Great Gatsby, I'm just going to use another book, still, you know, because this is the it was an anniversary year last year, the 2020. It was such a 100th anniversary, I think, of The Great Gatsby, and there was such a celebration, and I'm like, oh yeah, The Great Gatsby is important, but I think everyone knows that, and I still think there's a way in which The Color Purple, Black people, I think, understand its import and value, but I still think it's oddly forgotten as important as it was, which is, again, weird given all the standards that it's or all the accolades that it's achieved. So I don't know, it's not weird, it's just, I think, what happens to Black women's cultural production in American life. So that's why I wanted to do the American Masterpiece, to kind of remind us of this truth.
Thank you. I have so many more questions, but I don't know if we want to open it up to the audience. Like, I have a lot of questions, and
That's okay.
I could listen to you talk about this book all day.
You're so nice.
No, it really, it's, you know, it's, I'm thinking about, you know, how we teach the book, but also, again, just really how because I think it is about, like, how we see Black women, just like what you were talking about, but to kind of think about how Alice Walker, how she is even perceived even to this day, you know, and then I think what your book gives us is, it's such a gift to kind of hear the people who know her really well to talk about her. And you're able, I mean, you talk to so many important people, both important in terms of their relationship to The Color Purple, and then there's also, like, this celebrity, this, you know, you like, when Oprah says, I've never told anybody this before, I can't even imagine, like, what that moment must have felt for you as, you know, also an interviewer. So I don't know if we want to open it up for questions, and then, so if folks have questions, now would be just please put them in the chat, and I'll stop, but I'll keep talking, and hopefully somebody will pop in with some questions. I did want to ask you about, well, maybe we could talk about the Oprah, like the Oprah moment or what have you. And I think that, you know, I have, like, a vexed kind of, I think, relationship to Oprah. And so I thank you for this conversation with Oprah, because I didn't realize that she was not really Oprah before The Color Purple in the way we kind of think of her. So I was wondering if you can kind of talk about that, but also how she brings Sophia to life in a particular way in the movie, and what was important about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is her first acting role. And so she's one of the few who can, I guess, debut and make your character iconic all at once, right? Like, that's, like, pretty astonishing accomplishment. But I think what was fascinating about Oprah is, like, next to Alice Walker, I think The Color Purple has changed the trajectory of her life. So I didn't know that much. I didn't know that fact until I did this book and started doing the research, and then was able to interview her. And so I'll just say quickly that, she reads the book when it comes out. She reads the New York Times review by Mel Watkins. She rushes to the bookstore in Baltimore. She reads it while she's standing there, and then becomes an evangelist. So my joke is like, oh, this is the beginning of the Oprah Book Club. Like, this is because she starts buying copies and just handing it out to people in Baltimore. She moves to Chicago. She's continuing to give people copies of books, like on subways and on street corners, and everyone she meets, she's like, you have to read this book, because she saw herself in that story. And we're all familiar with Oprah's own sexual assault history, and being pregnant as a result of a sexual assault. And so she was able to see herself so fully in Celie, like, and it was such a revelation, I suppose, for her to see a Black girl from the segregated South, whose story was not only shown in this novel, but had such a beautiful arc of healing and coming into one's own. And so the story is that, Quincy Jones happens to be in Chicago for a lawsuit with, I think, Thriller. He wakes up early one morning and he sees this woman, Oprah Winfrey, on AM Chicago. And he's like, I think I found Sophia, which doesn't make, sense if you think about all the things, like, he's watching TV, this is Sophia. So anyway, she auditions for the part and she doesn't hear back for months. And she wants this part so badly. And she eventually gets it, but it's after much consternation and much loss of faith. And so in her interview with me, and in this part, I think she's quite public about, that's the moment when she realized she never wanted anything more in her life. And then she had to let it go. And so that's the moment in which she learned the art of surrender. And then she also learned to negotiate her show, and it became the Oprah Winfrey Show. But I think for me, what was important is that Oprah, for our generation, it was Oprah Winfrey and her daily television shows who normalized the coming out as a sexual assault survivor. And so I thought The Color Purple helped her find her voice, but also gave her permission to tell her own story and to tell the stories of thousands of others. And that was important to me as a survivor as well. When I think about the litany of women, Black women, who made it possible for me to confront my truth, it's Maya, it's Toni, it's Oprah, it's Alice. And so I thought it was pretty important to include her in this story for me.
All right, thank you.
I think there's something in the chat.
Yeah, I see we have something in the chat. I'll read it and then you can respond, maybe, so people know what's being. I think it's so interesting how Salamisha found a sense of life force or agency from each of the three women from the story, Celie, Shug, and Sophia, in the various stages of her life. Want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, yeah, I mean, you don't know that until there are works of art that you return to repeatedly. And so if you get the chance to have fallen in love with a piece of art that can map onto you, and then you can map onto it, you're really lucky. And I think for me, The Color Purple is obviously one of those works, but it's such a rich book of the complexity of Black womanhood. I'm working on a project right now on Nina Simone and her song For Women, right? That's another way in which you can get, there's very, that now we have a lot more of the multiplicity of Black women, or the magnitude of our identities is more apparent in television and film. But The Color Purple was definitely one of the places where we got to see Black women loving each other, having friendships, sisterhood, and defining the world for each other. And that was another radical intervention, partly inspired by Their Eyes Are Watching God, but really an expansion of the friendship between Phoebe and Janie there into a really beautiful way in The Color Purple.
So maybe we can end on a question about the ending. I just, and if somebody has any other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But given what you just said, and yes, and given, I mean, I think that it's so clearly, it's a novel about, sisterhood and, coming into one's own voice and art and creative, like it's all of these things around Black womanhood. Like you said, it just maps it. And I love that I'm super excited for your book about Nina Simone. And For Women is, I teach a class on Black women in the US, and we always open with For Women to kind of think through what that work is doing. But I think it's so interesting what you do in this book is that you end sort of with Mr. and but it doesn't displace the women at all. But it's such an important, I think that you're making a really important kind of intervention in kind of how we think about Mr. But I was wondering if you could just kind of, and maybe read a little bit from the ending and talk
Sure.
about that.
Yeah, I wrote a piece also in the New York Times, making kind of building on that piece a little bit as well, because I found that by the end of the book, I kind of knew what the story, the next iteration was that alongside Celie, it is Albert, Mr., who has the fullest arc in this book, and that Alice, a consistent theme in her work, whether it's The Third Life of Grange Copeland or Meridian or many of her short stories, is this idea that no character is irredeemable. She's a very generous writer in that way. And so Albert's path to healing, just as someone who's abused Celie and abused Harpo, but that there's an insistence and there's a patience in the book that Albert also has the right to and should be allowed to heal and to redeem himself in the eyes of those he's harmed. And that's like, there's not a lot of books that really to do that, right? Like they don't, that they kind of recover these characters. Lots of books and films may have that character as the primary person. So we never have that ambivalence really, that even if they do this harm, we're already in their vantage point. But she doesn't make him the center of the book. And yet she also gives him the possibility to change. And so in our era of Me Too, where we still have lots of people being held accountable, but few trying to atone. This moment of, I was thinking of in January 6th, right? The way in which these debates about forgiveness and moving past the harm that's done is being pushed out, as opposed to people having to go through a real process of racial reconciliation. I mean, Alice Walker, through the character of Albert, gives us a model for someone who wants to make amends. And so I think I wanted to end on that. In a similar way with Sites of Slavery, my first book, I end with a chapter on reparations. I mean, I think there's an impulse on my part to try to understand the potential past the harm and past the trauma. What's after that, right? What's the possibilities for healing? What's the possibilities for forgiveness? And so whether it's reparations for slavery, as I argued in the first book, or whether it's Albert's reconciliation with his family, I think that it's beautiful when artists can give us these alternatives to our present in order for us to live our way to that future. So that's the answer to the question.
No, it's such a beautiful work. And I thank you for this, because I think that this brought me to The Color Purple in a different way than I've come to The Color Purple in before. As much as I've loved the work, I think that you uncovered like a different kind of encounter with it. So I want to thank you so much for this beautiful, beautiful work.
Thank you. Thank you for such a kind conversation. And thank you, Allison, for inviting us to be in conversation with each other.
Yes.
Thank you
Allison.
both. I think you can probably see my smile. That the conversation was so enjoyable and so important. And so we're so happy that you both could be with us and that we got to be a part of the In Search of Color Purple tour. We're rooting for the book, at our bookstore. And I think I mentioned before, just to everyone, that both books by both of our authors today, you can find at sourcebooksellers.online.com.
Yes.
And just to let everyone know that May 18th, there will be a presentation, and we can get you in for just with an email for the book Blackface. It's an object lesson book by Bloomsbury publisher, and Ayanna Thompson and Natalie Hopkinson from Howard will be speaking with her. So we just have a wonderful lineup in May that's very, very exciting for that. And thank you again, both of you. And best wishes at the end of your semester, Dr. Winters, and the rest of your tour.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you for everyone for coming.
Thank you. All right. Be safe.
You
Bye-bye.